Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Yes, still wrapped in the pandemic. 3 billion people with a B.
Good evening, depending on where you are
Oh,
on this fast
sorry,
forward.
I'm getting,
Yes, still wrapped in the pandemic.
hold on a second. Why is that happening? I'm talking to myself. We don't want that. I think we're okay. Anyway, it's Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School. As always, technical weirdness, but that's just the way things are. As I was saying, there's still 3 billion people with a B who have not had a vaccination. There are obviously billions of people who have been exposed to this virus already, quote unquote, naturally. It's a huge challenge. This is an overheating planet. New IPCC climate panel report coming out the end of this month on the impacts and adaptation and vulnerability from climate change will reveal new challenges and opportunities to cut vulnerability, even as we cut emissions. An issue that has been in the news this week and perennially in the 33 years or whatever I've been writing about global warming is sea level rise. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration came out with a new report, the Ocean Services part, mandated by Congress, I think, to clarify sea level trajectories. And it had some new crystalline numbers on the near term side of things, the next 30 years. You know, I could still be alive to see how that plays out. I'm 65, so let's hope for that. So yeah, 30 years is not a lot of time. And now the conclusion was that 1 foot of sea level rise, according to this report, is their forecast, essentially like a weather forecast for 2050, with lots of trajectories and upward from there. I haven't seen any trajectories that are stable or down beyond 2050. And that still leads to all kinds of questions about how we all respond, whether you're a mayor, your president, or own coastal property, or you're an investor, or you're a poor person locked into a vulnerable flooding situation. These issues are real, significant, and building. But what do we do? So today we're going to talk with Jeremy Bassis, University of Michigan glaciologist, who's really focused also on these policy questions lately. He wrote a really provocative and interesting piece in EOS, the Journal of the American Geophysical Union, kind of their general interest journal, on how to get comfortable with uncertainty, get away from talking about the things that are really hard to understand still, and talk about what we really understand and make that a source of action. And A.R. Siders from University of Delaware, who's a champion of getting real about managing retreat. I still think there's a better word for this. I know we've talked about this many times. Managing response. Getting more traction, more action from data. The graphic I'm showing you here is from a paper by a former student, now a young researcher of Jeremy's. With the paper, I think, Jeremy, you said it's from Maine. Well, one of the lines in it is from ice sheets to Main Street. And that's really the focus of today's talk. How do we get from the glaciology and the physics of ocean change to societal change? It's great to have you both here. And let's just have everyone meet you. First of all, Jeremy, University of Michigan, hunkered down for a snowstorm.
Yeah, we are getting a pretty big storm right now. So we'll see if the power and internet stays on for this.
I'm trying to think, is that, am I looking out the window behind you? It looks like
you are looking at the window behind me at the beginning of the snowfall.
There we go. Yeah, here in the Hudson Valley, it's been like ridiculously like 50 degrees today. It was 10 degrees the other day. It's Whiplashville. And Dr. Siders, you're in Delaware, I assume, or not?
I am, and I'm jealous of the snow. We actually got snowfall over the weekend, but now it's 65 here. So yeah,
same weird phenomenon.
Thinking about whiplash, it's been a little crazy.
Yeah, so let's start with the source of all this. Not all of it, but the ice sheets. One of the most basic concepts in global warming, it's in my 1988 article, is that it's like opening your freezer, and what happens to the ice cream? It melts. And if it's ice that's stored on land and it goes into the ocean, then you're talking about adding volume to the oceans. Of course, the oceans are also heating. And when you heat water, that creates an expansion. And then many parts of the world are subsiding. Jakarta most dramatically, but all, many parts of the Gulf Coast. Juneau is rising. I think Juneau actually has the reverse. They're having sea level decline. But that's not what we're talking about today. So, Jeremy, how did you get going? What drew you to these masses of ice at the ends of the Earth, and what they mean for us?
I mean, my original foray into glaciology was purely random. I mean, I went to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I didn't really know what I wanted to study, but one of the people that I was interested in working on was on sabbatical. And then I ended up being offered a trip by Helen Fricker to Antarctica to study these gigantic propagating cracks in the ice. And so I went to Antarctica. I've been been working on ice sheets and ice masses ever since.
So, someday I'm going to do a whole session on what's called narrative fallacy. We all think there's a narrative. We create these post hoc narratives for our lives, for the state of the world. And every time I have someone on the show, there's some randomness, and you invent the narrative later. Well, that's so interesting. So that's very cool. And do you have any regrets?
No, I have no regrets. I mean, my path is even more random because I got into earth science originally because I went to a big state university and I was late for the first day of class because I had a hard time finding the room that it was in the building. And so I got in front, and the only space available was right in the middle, in the front row. And then about 10 minutes into the class, I realized this was not the class I had signed up for. But I couldn't leave because it would be humiliating. The professors were walking back and forth, making eye contact. I'm nodding. And so it was only about 20 minutes in that I realized, actually, this is kind of more interesting than what I was supposed to take. I don't remember what I was supposed to take, but it ended up being a weather or meteorology class looking at atmospheric fluid dynamics. And so I went and talked to him afterwards and saw if there was any opportunities to do research or jobs, or how do you actually do any of that stuff? So my path is just being in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time. I don't know which.
So actually, this is so interesting. I'm going to put Siders in the same seat before we get back to Antarctica. So hold on. Siders, I'm not sure I asked you how you got into this fix.
Equal randomness. And kudos to that teacher who in like 20 minutes got you, hooked on a totally different career path, right? I was going to go to med school in college until I decided to go to law school, which was an equally random decision. And then I didn't know what to do in law school. People think, speaking of like post fallacy, right? People think I did environmental law in law school, but that's not the case. So I went and worked for the Navy, and the Navy took one look at me and said, well, I guess you have a law degree and a biology degree. Obviously, you should go work at environmental issues. Yeah. So I did. And they were working at the time, they were thinking a lot about climate change and, think about making decisions, uncertainty, right? The military clearly does a lot of that. And so, started thinking about climate change, went and worked for the Center for Climate Change Law in New York City just as Hurricane Sandy hit. Like I literally started work a month before Sandy hit. So then it sort of became clear I was going to think about climate change and disasters and how we rebuild after things like that. So so a lot of serendipity at every stage along the way.
That's amazing. And I'll tell my story some other day. It has all the similar properties. So Jeremy, then, so let's jump to the ice. You've been just a thumbnail sketch of your research on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess my main line of research is trying to understand how fast the ice sheets are going to disappear in response to climate change. And so a lot of things I've been looking at is how quickly they can break. And that involved us kind of trying to understand if you get these gigantic cliffs, if they will disintegrate, become unstable, this idea called the marine ice cliff instability, right. How the water tickles the bottom and if that can cause them to become unstable. And we've been trying to model these processes that we don't understand that well and try and make sure that they're incorporated in the next generation of models so that we can incorporate the fact that maybe we have fast, rapid ice sheet collapse or change that's faster than the models predicted, or at the very least, so that we can predict the processes that are going to really dominate. Right. And the op-ed that you have up is kind of a little bit of my own frustration that we are not going to reduce the uncertainty in our sea level projections out to 2100. And it's probably not something that we should even try to do, because every time we learn something new, and ice sheet science glaciology is a relatively new field with a lot of new observations, we discover something new, and that often means that we realize that some of our way of thinking was wrong, or there are new processes that we need to think about. And the ice sheet is heading towards a very different world where we don't have a lot of observations to constrain the models. And so we want to understand it better, but we shouldn't limit ourselves by trying to really narrow down that uncertainty. We need to make decisions with that uncertainty in mind.
Yeah, and I've been trying to make this point for many, many years in my articles. One of the problems in the media, and that's been my realm, is we love things like marine ice cliff instability and words like collapse. I did a whole session here in January on the word collapsed in the context of ice sheets. And some of your colleagues were on, and they were wonderfully clear about how misinterpreted that word has been by some scientists too, or they throw it around casually and then it gets into a headline and their research gets attention and that makes everyone at the university happy and makes NSF happy. But then you get this kickback. You get, well, actually, and your work is part of the kickback. It shows this model that, well, when that collapse happens, it kind of builds this big pile of rubble and it can sort of slow things down. And I've even come up with having warning signs on social media. I have these like yellow signs, warning, whiplash ahead, because we get whiplash science and whiplash coverage. And what is unfortunate about that is that then the average person thinks that means, well, it means that scientists don't know anything, therefore don't do anything, or you lose trust in the media. I mean, because the media have overplayed it, and then, oh wait, what's this story? And it creates a mess. So, Siders, I know you deal with that, whether it's a mayor or a city council or planners or the public sphere or infrastructure money. What's been happening in that? When you read his piece, was this like a yay or what?
Oh yeah, no, Jeremy, I thought this piece was great because I thought it really resonated on a lot of levels. It's interesting that we have evidence that people have trouble making decisions in uncertainty, that they can get locked in, right? They can think, hey, it's uncertain, I'm just not going to do anything, which is very often the wrong choice because the options are A or B, and you've chosen to do nothing, which is C, which is actually worse than either of the uncertain options you had ahead of you. But then it's also interesting because we make decisions in uncertainty all the time, right? It's going to rain here till later tonight. At least there's a 30% chance it will rain. So should I take my umbrella or not, right? It's not like I'm locked into, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay in the office, right? It's uncertainty, and I'm going to take some decisions based on how much risk I'm willing to face. Like, there's a chance I'll get wet. Am I okay with that or not, right? And I can make those rational decisions. And even organizations are good at this. I mean, I mentioned the military before. They make decisions with uncertainty all the time. And so we have tools to deal with this uncertainty, and there are new tools being developed specifically to deal with uncertainty for climate change and decision making. And so I think there's a really interesting component about this psychology of how do we just get over that barrier, right? Yeah, there's some uncertainty. We still have to take action. And it comes down to really concrete things. I remember having a conversation with people about engineers about SeaLevel Rise, right? And thinking about how high should we build the flood wall? Should we build it, to 2 feet or 3 feet? And they said, oh, well, we don't know how high sea level rise will be, so we just won't include that at all. And I said, no. The range of sea level rise does not include 0 inches of sea level rise, right? The range of uncertainty about sea level rise is always some amount. So the options you can pick are the lower end or the higher end, but 0 is not. Yeah. That is definitely certain to not happen. So it's interesting that sometimes we're defaulting to that position.
This paper, there was a paper a few years ago, 2016, by Clark and others. Susan Solomon was an author, Ray Pierre Humbert. And this illustration to me really nails things beautifully. This is a simplified version I did of the graphic in their paper, where I added the label, choose the sea level for the next 10,000 years. And those are 4 emission scenarios over here to the right. And the high one is 50 meters. The low one is like 10 meters. And today is right there. So today is halfway through this period from the Holocene through the first stage of the Anthropocene. And and you can see they have, this is a fully deglaciated Greenland in a substantially deglaciated Antarctica. So that, those timescales don't really matter for what we're talking about here today. But this part in the middle, this like the launching pad options, they are in the new report from NOAA. And if that, that seems to be where there's a lot of potential to tell a new story. I wanted to bring in, I think I had you on here a year ago, maybe, Siders, when maybe we were talking about managed retreat because Columbia had a big meeting on it, 2 of them now. And you and Catherine, is it Mock or Match? Mock.
Mock, yeah.
Had done a paper, and this is your piece in the conversation, on this concept of normalizing, designing for change on coasts. And where have you gotten more pushback on, from like climate skeptics or from like climate believers, meaning people who are worried about climate change?
That's interesting. You know,
Or
most
not.
of the
Maybe everyone's just going, "Yay, this is great."
No. It's certainly uniform pushback. I think that's the idea. How much are we getting on this? No, I think actually a lot of people are coming around to this idea that this might need to happen on some scale. I think where people are concerned about is the time scale that this is going to happen. That's where the uncertainty is scary for them. Yeah. A lot of people hear about managed retreat and their thought is someone's going to force me out of my home tomorrow or next year, right? Instead of, hey, we're going to try to create a plan for the community that 100 years from now, no one will live in this house, right? And that's a very different idea of managed retreat. And so that's part of what we talk about in this paper and in some others is that timeline is really different. When you start talking about, well, a decade or 30 years from now, you know, as you pointed out, hey, are you going to be alive in 30 years? Some coastal homeowners won't be alive by 2100. Right. So frankly, they don't have a personal investment in whether or not their homes are there in 2100. So when we think about those timelines, it creates a lot more space for people to not push back. It creates space for them to see how that transition could happen. Because I think that's one of the big pieces with this coastal development is the transition piece we're trying to look for.
Right. And yeah, and then the short time scale, like after Sandy, with buyouts and like some homeowners didn't want to take the buyouts. Well, you know, have you kept track there enough to give a sketch of how in that short time scale things played out?
Not in that particular example. So,
well, you might have other.
Yeah. People are accepting buyouts around the U.S. right now. We actually just did a project where we interviewed 2 dozen buyout practitioners in 6 different states, Midwest and coastal states, to look at how they're administering buyouts. And what we thought was interesting is we thought it was going to be a problem for them to try to convince people to take the buyout, but actually they all had wait lists. They all have a longer list of people who want to be bought out than they have money to buy them out. And so the challenge for them wasn't how do we convince people to do this, it was how do we find funding to make this happen. And then the flip side of this, so one of the things we talk about in this paper is just that strategies to deal with SeaLevel rise are probably going to require all of these tools. So managed retreat, also some level of coastal armoring, also nature-based strategies, also elevation, all of them combined. So these pictures here are trying to show this idea that it's really unlikely that you're going to use just one. Even our walled scenario, there had to be some retreat to make room for the retention ponds and the pumping stations and everything else that you'd need to deal with living in a walled-in city. So even if you say we're going all in on armoring, you actually probably still need a blend. We started trying to think about these more as like ingredients in a recipe. Yeah, you can use the same ingredients to make different recipes depending on the ratio of different ingredients that you use. And one of the pieces that I think really ties into the uncertainty, Jeremy, one of the lines I really liked in your op-ed was this sort of focus on what we have certainty. And I was almost reading that as focus on what we can control in some ways too. Because a big piece of uncertainty in all of this is how much are we going to build in an area that's exposed to sea level rise. Right? We have a master's student here at UD last year, Luniba Mananhar, who did her thesis looking at sources of uncertainty for future damage from storms and sea level rise. And she actually found that the biggest source of uncertainty wasn't the sea level rise projection, and it wasn't which storm model you used. It was how much development do you think is going to occur on the coast? And that's interesting because that's something that local governments could control, right? They could determine, are we going to build all of our new housing on the coast in the floodplain, or are we going to build it somewhere else, right? So when we think about the consequences of sea level rise, we have consequences of sea level rise for the infrastructure that's already there, which is where we have to start thinking about retreat and other solutions. But we also have this massive uncertainty of how much more are we going to put in that area? How much more are we going to expose? And I think that's interesting because it's uncertain, but it's an uncertainty that we can control. And so I think there's a lot of focus we can put there on that. We get to determine that uncertainty element.
One thing before we jump back to Jeremy, I've been noticing, I think Zillow and there's several real estate websites now that are starting to list not just flood risk, but several different levels of climate risk to a property, so that you as a potential homeowner are starting to get a little advance, at least some flicker of thinking about the future. Have you tracked that?
Yeah, this is an emerging thing, is really focusing on flood disclosure. So the Natural Resources Defense Council did a great map of different states and their flood disclosure laws. But then people have been looking at this more granularly too. What are people requiring? Because it goes back to this idea of, how do I want to deal with uncertainty, right? Am I willing to go out in the rain and risk getting wet or not? And maybe I'm okay with that, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm okay with living in a house that floods and I have to kayak to the grocery store, and maybe I'm not, right? Some people are and some people aren't. And so the question is, do you have enough information to make that decision? And part of that is this uncertainty. Well, how bad is sea level rise going to get? But part of it is just knowing, do you even know that you're in the floodplain at all? Do you even know that this is possible?
Right.
And that can sometimes just come down to what information is provided to you. So a lot of these organizations, Zillow, First Street Foundation, there's Flood Factor now, trying to give you more information about the risk that you might be taking on, so that you can make an informed decision, still dealing with uncertainty, but now you now understand the risk that you might be taking, depending on what happens.
These are promising. I mean, to me, these are promising signals. And I've written about this also in the context of wildfire. There are lots of, Headwaters Economics, for example, is a Western think tank that's done a lot of work in wildfire risk, and there's innumerable opportunities to cut vulnerability in an existing home, and certainly to look at landscapes going forward, planning a community with wildfire in mind. But when I wrote about it first in 2017, it had already been running for several years, and they had like 29 communities that had utilized their service so far. And I'm thinking of the scale of these issues, and I'm wondering, how in the world do we facilitate these things at scale? And Jeremy, this kind of conversation, I would love to think I can help facilitate happening more, but it shouldn't take me. So how do we get glaciologists and policy folks and law folks and real estate folks to talk more to each other? Have you been exploring that?
Yeah, this is actually kind of one of the things that I've been thinking about the most recently. And I think that one of the things is that science often deals or prefers to deal with things that we don't know. So if we don't know it, it's not new science. And so when we're doing our PhD projects, we're advising our students, we're proposing new projects, we are focused on the things we don't know. That often ends up being the things that get covered by the media because they're new, they're exciting. They might also be pretty speculative. They might be pretty uncertain. So they're not necessarily the kind of things that are consensus or what you want to make decision-making based on. And I thought there were some really great points that, and I tried to make this in the piece, that we actually do know a lot. And I think it's a perfect example, right? Sea level is not going to be zero except in a very, very special places.
Right.
And we know it's rising. And we know that the risks are already increasing, and we need to do something about it.
Right.
So the way I've been thinking about this is that we probably need to rethink the way our education programs work, so that our students have opportunities to actually talk to communities and find out what their vulnerabilities are and what their needs are. And that can often generate new research questions, things that we hadn't really been thinking about. Global sea level rise is the big thing that we work on. But that's not really relevant to local planning, because you need local sea level rise. And that includes local effects. Subsidence can be huge in some of these regions. Natural variability is not included in the recent report, but is still on the order of 10 centimeters, just sloshing things back and forth. If you're thinking about sea level rise, increased storm surges, and then you plot on top of this kind of sloshing of the ocean, that ends up being increasing your vulnerabilities. And then the other part of it is, I think we need to involve historians to a certain extent. I mean, we know that there's a history in which marginalized community, Black and brown communities are experiencing more flooding. I also know that when I talk to adaptation planners, they're almost all white and representing wealthy communities. And it worries me that San Francisco, the Bay Area, becomes a walled off community while the areas around them drown. So I don't know how we move towards that direction. But I think scientists can play a role by interacting in bigger teams in which we kind of think about those bigger problems together.
Oh, here. Well, I mean, this is a cheering section here, I think, for what you're talking about. One of my when I came to Columbia University to the Earth Institute, that's now the climate school, a big chunk of the way I perceive my job is a lot of outward facing stuff like this, and a lot of inward plumbing, building, breaking down walls, building pipelines, getting in crosstalk. And actually, I think it's been more feasible on the internet in COVID time than it was to do on campuses. And so many of the institutional norms in academia and in government are still set up not to do those things. And again, back to you, Siders, you moved to UDel a little while recently, right? What's been your experience? Are there some flickers of hope?
Yeah, this is year 3, which is surreal, given that that's two of it in pandemic mode, I guess. So it doesn't feel like that long. One of the reasons I came to U Delaware is because they are pushing to do interdisciplinary work. So I'm here at the Disaster Research Center, which is specifically designed to be an interdisciplinary center to study these kinds of issues. Right, so we just got a grant with an engineer, right? So I'm working with an engineer on how we think about modeling decisions to how to deal with SeaLevel rise and roads. And we have an anthropologist on the team who thinks about disaster and anthropology to give these sort of rich historic issues. So we have this blend of disciplines even within the center, and then the university is trying really hard to push for more interdisciplinary programs to train our students, and then interdisciplinary work on the research. Of course, it's difficult because the university still has, right, you still have departments, you still have disciplinary silos, you have to think about how people are rewarded for the research they do. And those rewards are different, right? Like an anthropologist who wants to write a book and spend the next 8 years doing that project, as opposed to someone who needs to get out an engineering model, in the next 12 months. Just thinking about those timelines and how they approach that is really difficult. So I think there are definitely glimmers of hope. This is definitely an area people are investing in. It's too easy for institutions to say they're committed to interdisciplinarity, and it's really difficult for places to commit to that. I mean, you're Columbia, you're the Earth, we're no longer the Earth Institute, now the Climate School. But so you're at the center of an institution who's trying to change all of its institutional norms to get around those silos. And so I think there's obviously glimmers of hope here. It's just a challenge to overcome all those structural barriers.
I early last year, I think it was March, I ran a session on here after 8 postdocs at Columbia, 7 at Columbia, 1 elsewhere who had been at Columbia, wrote a paper in Nature Sustainability, kind of commentary. It was sort of a manifesto for how to design a university that can address problems in the real world that we face. And there were a pretty simple little set of findings. One was time. You have to incentivize time to do community-based multidisciplinary work, because you have to build fluency and trust, and those take time. And what happens, it was Meg Maurer made an incredibly important comment about what happens is you end up going for the low fruit. If you're a postdoc, you're just trying to get published, and rather than writing the exploratory paper requiring time and crosstalk, you write the paper that you can get published easily. So we don't reach for those bigger thresholds. It seems really important. And hopefully, the question is, how do you build those incentives into this 200-year-old, 300-year-old system? There is hope, I think, and it does involve a lot of crosstalk. On campuses, everyone could do this kind of thing we're doing right now. If there's a facilitator. I want to show you something that I wrote that gets right at the point that Jeremy made, and I know you care about as well, Siders. It's just, where is it? Just stop screen, share screen.
I actually just wanted to comment while you're pulling that up, Andy, what you mentioned about having a facilitator. So Dr. Amanda Cravens is a person I work with a lot. She works at the USGS, and she's actually been doing a lot of work on the role of these facilitators for interdisciplinary work and how important they can be. Because I think people step back and they think, oh, obviously academics should be able to talk to each other. How difficult is that? Like, Jeremy, you and I should just be able to have a chat. We don't need Andy, right? But actually, it can be incredibly difficult if you and I are using terms in different ways, if we don't understand each other's methods, or worse, if we don't respect each other's methods. As a qualitative methods person, that's sometimes a problem, right? So having that facilitator can actually be really critical to making those kinds of conversations productive, and making sure everyone's on the same page, speaking the same way. And that's really important. I mean, people use the word uncertainty, for example, in really technical ways, right? So I appreciate that
Right.
today we're sort of using it in a general sense, but Jeremy, I'm sure you you interact with it in all kinds of technical ways where it's defined certain ways. And so making sure we're all just using that language the same way is more difficult than it seems like it should be, I think. But I think there is a big role for that kind of facilitation to happen.
Oh yeah, and I see it at every level. I was at a meeting just before COVID in Montreal on technology for sustainability, and there was a professional facilitator at the meeting. One of these people with a whiteboard and that stuff, and he's actually part of an international network of volunteer facilitators. I have to get him on a.
That's such a cool. I mean,
It's
what a
like,
cool job,
there's Engineers Without Borders and there's Doctors Without Borders. There's Facilitators Without Borders. That's not the name of it, but I've got to go back. So and it is a skill set and it is a professional need. The other people who come to mind are people like Susie Moser, which is not so much about facilitation, but about fluency and working with
communication in general. Yeah.
Yeah. And at Columbia, Andrew Koshevitz, he works a lot with the International Red Cross on building another kind of fluency and comfort level, which is with communities at risk. Bangladesh and Rohingya refugee camps. How do you make climate information usable on the ground? And it's a thing, but he's very passionate about what he does is sort of an informal, there's not a name for it, and there has to be a name for it, I think. Jeremy, I don't know if you want to comment while I pull up this thing on
students are pretty great at helping to make some of those connections and having interdisciplinary projects. I mean, I think you had that paper from Liz Olty, who is now at Middlebury College on from ice sheets to main streets. And she was interested in kind of understanding, we all say that ice sheets are useful for policy. She wanted to know actually how are these sea level projections used? And so we involved Maria Carmen Lemos, because Liz is kind of really, really good at involving other people in the university who's a social scientist. And so you can do these things. One of the challenges is not everyone in every single department respects these type of initiatives. And so I think it's kind of what you were pointing out. You get the siloing, and unfortunately, people will use things very technically and not always want to do that type of communication. But I don't see any reason why our institutions, as they are now, can't embrace interdisciplinary projects that have a chapter of their dissertation focusing on adaptation as well as physical science. There's nothing in our models that prevent it. It's just our own time and the fact that it's sometimes hard for the students to do it, and that we need to provide structure.
Well, by the way, I not long after I launched this thing called Sustain What, I made it available to students to use. It's still way slower than it should be, but I allow what are called friendly takeovers. It could be faculty, it could be at your universities, doesn't have to be at Columbia. So, what I do is just sort of shepherd, and then I go into the green room and sip my coffee, and so we can. This is something that can be taught, too, as well. So I think there's possibilities there. That's really good to know. I got to get Liz on here. It sounds like that's pretty clear, because this paper looks great. Siders, you used an interesting word a couple of minutes ago describing how you do your analysis. You call it qualitative. And that's not like this has happened to me before, where in discussions about social and physical and natural sciences, what you hear, Bob Brule at Drexel used to bemoan how natural science people cast aspersions on on the social sciences for not having a paradigm, like what's qualitative analysis? So does that come up often as a resistance point?
Well, I haven't heard that one about us not having a paradigm, but actually it's sort of it was a slip of my own tongue, in that I tend to try to tell students that we have qualitative and quantitative data rather than quantitative and qualitative methods. But to the extent that I work at case studies and I do interviews, right, and I deal with people giving descriptions of things rather than counting up responses or doing numeric models, right, and sometimes we do both. One of the projects I'm most excited about, we're trying to look at, how you would quantify equity in different ways, right, and how that would change model outputs. So there are ways to think about that. But I think, it's a big push, at least in several of the programs here at U Delaware. There's a big push to try to get students to understand that there's a method and a rigor to that. I've had people in the past say, "Oh, that's not so hard. You're just talking to people," right? Or I've had people in the past say, "Why'd you get a PhD? You had a law degree already. You could have just gone and talked to people." Thinking, "Oh, wow." As a lawyer, how arrogant of us lawyers to think that we can just do everything social scientists do, right, without any training on it. And I realized most lawyers are wiser than that. But it's interesting because it's very rare that someone would turn around and say, "Oh, Jeremy, obviously I could run your model without any further, insight into how that's done." Yeah. It's ridiculous. I can't even finish that sentence with a straight face because it couldn't be done. But
I can't run my own model half the time. So
thanks. That makes me feel better actually about my code not working today. But I think there's a lot of growing respect for that and growing recognition that we need those rich descriptive understandings of what's happening as well as the numbers. For example, we could come up with a very solid number. Let's imagine we had 0 uncertainty about sea level rise. We would still have a lot of uncertainty about what a foot of sea level rise means to people, right? That would be very different to a person who lives in a house that's elevated, a person who lives in a house that's right on the ground, a person who owns that house versus someone who rents that house, someone who's wealthy, someone who's not. Even having a certain amount of damage might mean something very different to someone who's a vacation homeowner, right? There are so many pieces there that would influence what that would actually translate to in terms of how it affects someone's lives. Right. So, we need those rich descriptions as well as the numerical quantitative, analysis in order to pair them to really understand what's going to happen and how people might, experience it and then what we can do about it.
And, Jeremy, you said something really important about all the sciences, but definitely the natural sciences. You study the things we don't know. And I flashed earlier, I got to put it back up because Adam Sobel, who's I think you all know him, or at least I know Siders knows him really well. He wrote a paper, kind of a call to action paper on usable science that he, after doing a lot of basic climate science and working on hurricanes in the context of climate change, and he's shifted his science to his whole focus is adaptation resilience, because he just feels like he has to do the thing that needs to be done, which is to build a better relationship between people and the climate, which is different than understanding the climate. And I don't know whether that gets to the point of having someone like you think even about your own next 20 years of your work. I'm not sure. You must be, I bet you're tenured. Are you tenured?
I am.
Yeah.
Fortunately, at this point during the pandemic, I would not want to go through that process.
I'm sure not. But it's like,
you're not making me feel better, Jeremy. Thanks.
You will do fine.
Still in my future.
Well, I think there's 2 people here who will write letters for you, Siders, for whatever. Not that that's necessarily worth a lot. So is there much of a discussion you hear, in the community of people with skills like you have of, if the uncertainty, and if you can't address the uncertainty on a time scale relevant to policy, is this the best use of your time and your skills for the next 20 years?
So that's an excellent question. I guess the question is, and an argument that I've had with a lot of different people on the physical science side, is whether the uncertainty of physical science is actually the largest uncertainty. And to be honest, it often is not. Work from social science and other people have pretty clearly pointed out that there's pretty different perceptions of risk, resources, and everything else. And so the question which you're raising is a really foundational one of what is the role of physical science in this adaptation problem. And I guess my view on this, and it is informed by a number of very, very smart social scientists and other physical scientists, is that you can think of adaptation as happening on the national, international scale, and people like me have very little ability to influence that. And I think we all know that that's slow and frustrating. And to be honest, the political level of that, at least for me, just seems way too cruel to get involved.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can have a lot more influence at the direct community level. So there's a ton of communities globally within the United States, probably close to where we all live, that need to adapt, not just to sea level rise, but to increase flood risks, And
Sure.
the question is, what is the science that we can provide them to help make those decisions? And so my view of it right now is that science is one piece, but only one piece of a social science puzzle that also involves engineering. And if you don't know the engineering solutions, it's hard to figure out what the relevant science is. And if you don't know
Sure.
what the political landscape is, you can't even recommend those solutions. And we need people that can interface between those three things and don't just sit in their physical science tower and throw out papers and projections like paper airplanes that they hope someone is going to catch and read, and then suddenly a whole policy comes up, right? I mean, I think it's going to be an iterative process in which we can provide different information if it's useful. But I think that that dialogue of what is useful, what is usable needs to happen, which is kind of, I think, Adam's point.
Yeah, and you just remind me of a discussion I ran here right when Biden, before he was coming into office, about what science advice should look like going forward. And in the context of COVID and climate and everything. And the reason people were so eager, so happy to see the science level raised, the science advisor raised to the level of the cabinet, is not to be there to hand out a report, but to be there to converse, to be there in an open discussion. Neil Lane, who had been in that position, in positions of advice like that, was one of the people on I think it was Neil Lane, who's on the show. And I love that idea that it's not just, okay, now turn to the science advisor. What do you think? Period. End of story. It's about fluency, the same kind of fluency. So that feels very synchronous.
Yeah. And I think that, at least for me, for most of my career, we've thought of science communication as something where we're lecturing, preaching to the public. Whereas at this stage in my career, I think a lot more of science communication actually involves listening. And I think as scientists that we need to do a little bit more listening to what the community needs are so we can figure out how we can make use of our expertise. Because I don't think that just writing more papers about the marine ice cliff instability is going to lead to sudden adaptation strategies that will be usable. And we need to make those decisions now because of things that we've been mentioning, right? Zoning, mortgages, roads, power plants, all of these things are things that we don't have decades to worry about. And people's lives are at stake if we don't do anything.
Yeah. And actually, before we get to the end, we have another 5 or 10 minutes, if it's okay with both of you. A lot of this relates to what are the questions we ask, and or what are the questions that funders fund. I think there's been a bias in setting aside NSF. I think, like when foundations or others are funding stuff around climate, there's been an over focus on driving the urgency of decarbonization. One way or the other, a lot of money has been spent on that, whether through communication, whether through funding. And I think maybe it's just a harder story, a harder mission to make the center of the conversation vulnerability. And to me, like I've been guilty when I started this 88. It was the science. I was suckered into, like, this is a great story, CO2, it's going in the atmosphere. And it took me way too long to put risk and vulnerability in the foreground, which is what we actually care about, right? Climate risk is the thing you want to avoid. Climate opportunity is the thing you want to build. And I just don't know whether the impetus is there yet. I'm pointing to this because this was Beth Tellman, who's at Columbia, now at Arizona. She's part of Cloud to Street. It's a new entity that's using data on human dynamics that basically showed people are moving into zones of flood risk faster than climate is changing zones of flood risk. All around the world, rich, poor, hundreds of millions of people are moving into areas that are flood prone because they're really valuable places to live. They're coastal cities or the like. And but I think that project also had this implicitly, they were asking a different question. It was about vulnerability and risk, not climate. It was as much about human change as climate change. Does that resonate, Siders?
Yeah, I think you're right that some ways the way we think about these things, and then even the way we use the words risk and vulnerability. I mean, to think about people using terms in very different ways, right? Disaster and climate people use define the phrase vulnerability in totally different ways. And
that's a problem.
Yeah, well, and at least two really clear ways to think about vulnerability is one is sort of, are you in the floodplain? Are you in the path of the hurricane? Are you in a place that could experience wildfire, right? So there's a vulnerability just from that exposure. And then there's a part of vulnerability, which is about how will it affect you? And that goes back to this, different people will experience it different ways, right?
Right.
Two people losing their cars in a flood, one of them who can go out and just purchase a new one or can use the company car, and another person who can't and has to rely on public transportation, they've down, et cetera. Same damage, same exposure, same damage they experience, but their lives are disrupted in completely different ways. So there's vulnerability at the, are you just in the floodplain? And then there's this more qualitative idea of how did you experience that, right? How did it affect you?
Right.
And so the way we ask questions about even that, even just understanding who's at risk, well, really depends on how you think about what risk is, right? And what pieces you're putting into that. And it's, yeah, I mean, and that's where we need a lot of this combination between the natural scientists and social scientists to be able to figure out not only what we think the damage will be, and the engineering, right? Like, what is the damage? How can we build better for this? And what are the social processes that determine where we're living, how we're building those homes, and how people experience those hazards.
And how to reduce the vulnerability gap. Meaning, this came up, I flashed it too quickly earlier. We have this big chunk of money now, the infrastructure bill, and maybe something will come through Build Back Better. And how that gets spent, there's a bias within our existing institutions, as I know Siders knows this too well, to the folks who have the lawyers and the technical people, the communities on the Hamptons are going to get more coastal resilient money than people who don't have that. And just another level of this imbalance that has to be identified, and pathways to rectify it are really important. So where could we go from here? What I do like to end these shows with some sense of something we could do either together that we can't do individually, or what would be a logical next step if we want to make some incremental moves. Now that SeaLevel report is out, would there be something I could do here with this platform that either of you thinks could move the needle a little bit, or did it spur you in some way to think it created more problems or more opportunities? Just little things that could lead us forward out of this conversation. Maybe Jeremy and then Siders.
Well, I think one thing that I think both of you are doing is leading us away from this really strong focus on sea level in 2100, which I'm not saying is not important, but there are a whole bunch of things that have to happen before then, and decisions that have to be made. And so one of the things that I really liked about the NOAA report is the focus on 30 years. I mean, that's a pretty important timescale for a lot of people. And right. I can understand we don't know what's going to happen in 2100, and there's a lot of uncertainty from the science side. But I think that moving towards those shorter series of steps, that what happens in 100 years is going to be a sequence of steps. And a lot of those things, the planning, the community involvement has to start now. And I think as scientists, one thing that we can think about, and one thing that would be really helpful to talk about with more people, is what can we provide to help that? What do you want us? What are the questions that we should be asking? Because I don't think we're even asking the right questions most of the time. And if we can better understand the building strategies, if we can think together about how to do it in a way that doesn't reinforce the current equities. I mean, we know that the history of infrastructure is that it cleaves the most vulnerable communities. And it benefits the most wealthy communities. And we don't want to do that again. I think most of us would agree. And I think that that's going to really require an interdisciplinary involvement. But I'm curious what the rest of you think.
Absolutely. And I think, especially on that last point, on that we know the history of this is that it creates inequity. And I think one of the challenges that hopefully this administration is taking on, right, is taking on head on, is this idea that we have an uneven playing ground. So you can't just give people money equally and assume that they are then going to somehow be equal, right? That there's an unequal playing ground to start with. You therefore have to be purposefully unequal in the way that you approach that in order to try to equalize things. So in some ways, we have to really purposefully target the inequity to deal with it, rather than just assume that being equal moving forward will be okay. And so I think we're starting to see more of a reckoning with that, and I think that's really exciting to see. Yeah, we have to address this justice issue head on, rather than hoping it will work itself out. And that probably, Andy, to your point, we were just talking about, with some local governments have more capacity than others to try to get this funding, right? So we need to specifically invest in projects that help build capacity of local governments to get further funding. And we need to change the way we distribute this money. So it's not purely based on, or not only purely, but so it doesn't, so it helps the people who need the help the most, rather than the people who are able to fill out the most paperwork. Yeah, so we need to change some of the fundamental ways we distribute this funding, both.
I just wanted to point to this this Justice 40 pledge by the administration, in theory, has some of that aspect in it. This organization, I thought, is UCLA is involved with this making Justice 40 a reality for frontline communities. Feels super important to this. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to kind of be sure.
No, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's exactly the kind of thing I think we need. Is that it's that Justice 40 is the idea that we need to target more funding to these communities who need it, rather than assuming that we have a fair process and that things will work out fairly because of that process. Right? We know that process hasn't worked in the past, so we need to fix it moving ahead.
Right.
One thing that universities can do is that we do have the expertise, law, science, in other words, to help actual vulnerable communities apply for that money. And I bet our students would really appreciate the opportunities to get involved, and would learn a lot from those types of opportunities.
And that gets back to the model of education. When I was at Pace University, where the environmental law program is one of the best in the country, they had a decades-old model of clinics, law clinics, that would take on problems in communities. And my friend John Cronin, who was the first river keeper for the Hudson River, the first river keeper for the whole system, he created a course that was an undergrad, sort of a mixed undergrad graduate course, that was a policy clinic, an environmental policy clinic. And I love that course. I helped him teach it one year when I was there, because it builds a model right from the earliest stages of these pre-professional young people, of engagement, of listening, of understanding complexity. And one other aspect of it, I got to get John on here to talk about it. Every semester, the students, as they were leaving, had to write an exit memo for the incoming students. And something about that model also, how many courses are taught in universities where your grade is taking a test as opposed to writing an exit memo? This is what I learned. This is what I would teach, tell the students coming in to work on this problem of community resilience. This is what they should be thinking about going forward. I love that, because it also captures the fact that these are slow. These are not, we're not going to solve global warming tomorrow. So that's my hope. That would be my clarion call, is, and that doesn't take too much. I think you can do that within the existing academic infrastructure, especially if you're tenured. So the courses are problem-based, community-based, as opposed to just learning. That feels like a really important part of this. Well, it's been great to have you both on. We're in a very busy time. If you have one more go forth comment to make, that'd be wonderful. Otherwise, good luck with the rest of the week and getting through the yet another thing called a weekend, whatever that is. Right. Any last call? Any last thoughts? Or otherwise, we're
no.
done.
Thank you so much for having this conversation. It's as you mentioned, more of these need to happen, and so thanks for having it and letting me be a part.
Great. Yeah. Well, I hope you can come back. We can iterate around this and build what back better for whom? That was the title of that piece. That's a big part of this. Imagining, and by the way, in a perfect world, it would be build forward better. I hate build back better, because you're building back brittle institutions, but that's for another day. Thanks again. This is Andy Revkin, the Columbia Climate School Sustain What show. Wherever you're watching this, share it after it's done. It becomes an archive video on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc. And thanks to my guests, A.R. Siders, who goes by your last name, right? It's not like I'm being weird by calling you that.
You're not. No, I use that as a nickname. Yep, it's perfectly fine.
And Jeremy Bassis at University of Michigan. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Great. Take care.